Hello and welcome to the garden. So in the previous video I was planting out the tomatoes in the greenhouses in the polytunnel, and in this video I'm going to continue with the planting. I'm going to start with some cucumbers, then I'm going to get the peppers in the greenhouses. Those are the larger fruited Bullhorn types, and then in the polytunnel I'm going to put some aubergines and some sweet banana peppers. See how much space I've got, see how many plants I've got. I can't remember how many I've got to go in there. And then it's a case of sorting out what we call the chilli house, because in the summer months it is jam-packed with chilies and the smaller fruited sweet peppers. So quite a lot still to do. Anyway, starting with these cucumbers. Now, this is one of the rare hybrids that I am growing this year. This is Carmen F1. Mainly doing it so that I don't have to worry about pinching out male flowers. It's a really productive cucumber. Now, normally, in the height of the season, one cucumber plant is enough for us. They're pretty productive, and there's a limit to how much cucumber one can eat. Early in the season, it's nice to have two, because when they're just getting going with the fruit, they're a little bit slower, of course, so it's nice to have two early in the season for the crop, but also planting one out is always a bit risky. So I never want to just put one cucumber plant in case for some reason you lose it to maybe a rot around the stem or a marauding slug or something. Whatever it happens to be, always safer to put a couple in. Now I happen this time to have three nice little plants, so I'm going to be silly and plant three. I will probably, I think, later in the season grub one of these out or pinch it out, because when they get going, three would produce a ridiculous amount of fruit, and Carmen is especially productive, so I don't want to go too crazy. Anyway, these really like it down this end of the greenhouse. Don't know why, but they always seem to thrive here, so that's where they're going. All right, so if I put that one in the middle there, put that one about there, I think, and that one can go there. That will be absolutely fine. So I'll mix this up a little bit, because I've spread compost on the top. Got to be careful. There's the soaker hose under there. I nearly put the trowel through it. I don't want to do that. So I'm not going to dig a deep hole here. What I tend to do is leave these just mounded up on the surface a little bit. Oh, this compost is ever so light, and you can see there's plenty of root there, definitely not pot bound. And I'll just leave that, if anything, mounded up slightly. I don't want this stem sitting in too much soggy soil, so that'll be fine, and you can get its roots down now. Yeah, three of these will be great. As I say, when they get going, they're going to be so productive. I will want to probably pinch out the center one. I will grow these up as single stems. Now, if the plant is particularly vigorous, you can probably take off a little bit of that soil down the bottom. Yeah, there we go. You see, because of the grit that's in it, it's very light. If the plant is vigorous, you can take more than one stem up, but I will be taking out the side shoots and keeping just one stem on these. Yeah, and there we go. So now I'm going to tackle the large fruited peppers, and although some years I will grow bell peppers, the last couple of seasons I haven't bothered. I suppose some of the other peppers I'm growing would fit in that category. I've got a poblano chili, very much like a bell pepper in form at least. But the Bullhorn peppers, for me, seem to do a little bit better. So once again, I'm putting a dozen Bullhorn peppers in each one of these greenhouses. Now, these are going to be spaced at 40 centimeters apart, and that is tons of space. In fact, I could probably push that to 30 the way I'm training these without any trouble, but 40 gives them lots of room, and so I can fit that dozen down this row nicely. You might be able to see on the camera if it picks it up. I've got these strings, they're just tucked out of the way, but I will train these up strings, and what I do with these, I don't pinch them out until they split normally. So I don't pinch them out on the top, because that would make a bushy plant, and that's not what I want in here. And when thinking of spacings, you've got to consider how you're going to train them. And if I were going to allow these to develop into a bushy plant, then I would have to give them more room. But what I'm going to do is take up 2 stems from each plant. You can take up 1 stem, 2, 3, 4, whatever you like. Depends entirely how you want to do it. But I think 2 stems per plant works really well. And at some point, these stems will naturally split. And at each split, I will take up just those 2 stems. And I will wrap string around those to support them. And by the end of the season, they'll be up here, really tall. With a bit of luck, they usually do get very tall. And they will crop very nicely off of just 2 stems. So you don't need a whole bushy plant to get a good crop. And it's particularly true, I think, of the larger fruited peppers, because there's a limit to how many fruits they can produce. And at each time that the stem divides, in the leaf axil there, you will get 1 or more flowers appear. So the number of times that stem divides all the way up to this sort of height, it's the potential for a lot of fruit. So I don't feel there's any need to have more than 2 stems, and 2 works perfectly. And at 40 centimeters, there's then lots of room. There's plenty of room for the root development for each plant, and they're definitely not crowded. They're not such bushy leafy plants that they need a lot of space. Anyway, enough waffle. The plants this year are not so big, and that is because, well, 2 reasons really. First is that I moved the sowing date, and that's because last year the plants were huge when they went in, and I had some trouble holding them back until conditions were reasonable for planting. So, you know, when the plant's up here, and some of them already had their first fruit on, so yeah, you know, tiny fruit, but nonetheless, there were flowers and fruits on a lot of the plants, and they were really tall. And of course, then they're packed in the propagators where I'm keeping them frost free overnight. And yeah, it's a little bit challenging to keep plants that size. So I've deliberately moved the sowing date, but then conditions were pretty miserable for a lot of the spring. So, you know, light levels have been, I mean, days have been really moody, a lot of cool, moody conditions, and it's not ideal for these plants. So I think growth has been a little bit slower than expected. I did think that, although I'd moved the sowing date by a few weeks, I did think they'd probably catch up. Sometimes when you do a later sowing, when you're sowing when light levels are better and it's warmer and so on, that later sowing can often catch up with an earlier sowing and sometimes go on to produce better plants, but not really the case this year. I mean, there's nothing wrong with these. They're perfectly fine, nice little plants. They're just not of the stature of last year's plants, and hopefully we'll get some nicer weather soon, because although the nighttime temperatures aren't going to be too bad for the next couple of weeks, it is going to be a bit moody again. There's a lot of showers on the way, and actually it's probably the amount of cloud cover that's giving us those mild night conditions. So in a way it's positive. We don't really want those clear skies. That's when we get the danger of radiation frost. But As a consequence, we've got a lot of wet, moody weather on the horizon. But never mind, these are going in today regardless, and it's nothing really to do with these. I will pull off the seed leaves because they're not good for anything. The one thing to look for, and I think these plants might actually be too small for it, sometimes if the plant is big enough, you can already see it splitting, that first natural division of the stem. And if you see that happening, you can orient the plant so that those two stems are nicely positioned for taking up on the strings. But it looks like I'm not going to be able to do that here. I don't think any of these have gone quite far enough. So I will just put them in, and well, I'll try to guess the best orientation, but I'm not going to be able to do a great job of that. But never mind, in they go. And of course I've got the tape measure here to keep me on track. I'll just loosen the soil here. I've been stomping around all over it. Let's have a look at these plants. Well, there's a bit of root in it. This is very wet compost because I gave these a good soak yesterday. I'm going to take off the seed leaves, but there's a nice bit of root there, definitely not pot bound. And unlike the tomatoes, I'm not really planting these deep, just maybe a centimetre further down. But very young plants can form roots from the stem, but as these stems get a bit more mature, they don't tend to do it, not like the tomatoes. So there's nothing to be gained really when they get to a certain age. There's nothing to be gained from sinking the more woody stems down deep. But that's just about perfect. And yeah, I will wait until I can pinch out. Sometimes the stems divide into two, sometimes three, and I will just keep two stems off of the initial branching, and then each subsequent time it branches, I will just keep the best positioned and train them on up. And away they go. Don't need the seed leaves. All the weeds. Again, not a huge amount of root on these. Better than being pot bound, but I had expected to see slightly better root system. But never mind. Once they're in this stuff, this is really nice soil. It gets such a large amount of horse compost on it, and I think once they get their roots down into this, they're going to be very happy plants. Anyway, I shall continue with this row. So I finished planting up the two greenhouses. There's a dozen yellow on one side and a dozen red on the other, and in the polytunnel here I'm going to put aubergines and sweet banana peppers, just as I did last season. Last year I planted half a dozen aubergines, and I like them. I put 3 different varieties in, but my wife's not keen on them, so they're really only for me. So I'm only going to put 4 in this year, and I've only got 1 variety. And then I was going to put the rest with sweet banana peppers, and I'm 2 plants short. Got more space in here, so I'm going to put 2 poblano peppers at the end. So the poblano is a sort of classic Mexican pepper, very, very mild, often eaten when it's green, but it will ripen to red, and it's a perfectly pleasant pepper. Looks a little bit like a bell pepper, but there's just a hint of warmth with it. Sweet banana looks a lot like the Hungarian hot wax, one of those pointy peppers. not as big as the Bullhorn types that I've got in the greenhouses, but still a pointy pepper with that sort of pale yellow green colour like a hot wax. And similarly, it will ripen to a sort of orangey red, not a deep red. The difference between the two, with the sweet banana, the fruits are a little bit bigger and there's no heat at all. So the hot wax can be a little bit variable, depends on the growing conditions, probably depends a little bit on the strain, but that can be sort of mildly hot, or some seasons like last year, they can have quite a bit of heat to them. They're really great pickled. These sweet banana, well, they're okay in the salad, but they excel when they're barbecued or fried, and they are just lovely. Really fond of those, and it's one of those peppers that I take when they're green and really enjoy them. The larger fruited sorts that are a dark green, I find them a little bit bitter to my taste, but these are great, and they're absolutely prolific. They produce tons of fruit, and they will produce it sooner than the big Bullhorn type. So it's nice to have that mix of large and smaller fruited sorts. The aubergine is long purple, and last year I was calling this leggy purple, and you would think that this was okay, it's wobbling all over the place, that this was a bit of a leggy seedling, but it isn't. There's nothing wrong with this at all. It's in the same propagator as all the other plants that are sat there looking stocky and nice. So this is not leggy, but it is thin and wobbly, and this is exactly how they were last year, although they were a bit bigger. And once they're in the ground, after some weeks, they will sort of thicken up, and they will produce really tall plants. They'll be up here by the end of the season. And for an ungrafted aubergine, I think they're pretty productive. I mean, it's a classic variety, so you know, it's not like a modern hybrid, but I think they're pretty productive, and 4 of these plants will give me tons of fruit. So I'm pretty happy with this variety. It's a very tasty fruit. It will hang well on the plant, and yeah, it's a very nice plant once it gets going, but when it starts off, it is a little bit weak and wobbly, and I'll probably put some split canes into just to give these a little bit of support. When they get a little bit bigger, again, I've got the strings here that I will tie around the base under. Typically I will tie it round where the first split in the stem forms, and of course that hasn't formed yet, so in the meantime I'll put a little bit of split cane in just to give that a little support so it's not flopping over. You know, if I've got the door open and there's a gust of wind, I don't want to damage the stems. But spacings, I'll give these 50 centimeters around these aubergines, and then the same as in the greenhouses, 40 between the sweet peppers here. That's it. I'm going to put a double row down the center of the bed, basically the same as last season. Worked pretty well in here. And then this area is more or less planted up. I've got room at each end. I could put, maybe I'll put a couple of spare tomato plants in. I will get some basil in here a little bit later, in a few weeks' time. And there's room for 1 or 2 little things, but the main planting in here is then done. I'm going to have to relocate these soaker hoses at some point. They're lying in awkward positions, but I can do that another time. Just a quick dig around here. Yeah, I mean, this soil looks quite nice in there. Good layer of organic matter on top. So I'm going to strip off these little leaves. This one's actually got a side shoot here, and I don't want it not that far down. I want the main stem to split somewhere up here. It will do it somewhere, it doesn't really matter where. That's all I'll remove at the moment. Nice little root ball. square pots do make nicer root systems than round, I'm sure of that. I don't want to plant it too deep. It can go in just a little bit lower than it was in the pot, but later on I will take these leaves off because they'll quickly go a bit manky down there near the ground. I'll leave them on for a couple of weeks though. And then I've got this old split cane. It's probably a little bit weak now. It's been hanging around for a while, but I think that'll be enough. I can just put one piece of string around there just to keep those upright. Support that stem slightly. So I'll go around above that leaf there. The string won't fall down. Just a little loop and the job is done. The peppers won't need any support. I'm just going to plant them just as I did in the greenhouses there. This is the sweet banana. I've got the signs of the very first buds in there. I'll take off these seed leaves, of course, plant it about that deep in the ground there, and that'll be it. The ones at the end, they're the poblanos. Nice little plants actually. All of these have produced slightly better, more substantial plants than some of the others, but I'll just finish this bit of planting. I'm not going to film all of that. That will be very dull indeed. And then it's on to the little greenhouse. So the final job is to pot up these sweet peppers and chilies. So I've got the smaller fruited of the sweet peppers here, and then I've got all of the chilies, and I'm going to get, I think, 36 in this greenhouse. I like to grow a mixture of small and large fruited sweet peppers because the big ones, like the Bullhorn types I've got in the main greenhouses, they take a long time to develop. So the fruit are large, it takes them longer to produce that fruit, and then it takes even longer to ripen. So I'll get a much earlier crop if I've also got some small ones, and I like the variety. Now I'm going to be putting those in big old pots, 10-litre pots, and in the previous video I waffled on a bit about feed and how I don't like to use too much liquid feed. There are times when it's essential, and if the plant's not otherwise going to get the nutrients it needs, obviously you have to provide some liquid feed, but I prefer not to. And in a pot this size, one pepper or chili plant will happily grow for the entire season without routine liquid feed for sure. And usually I don't give any liquid feed in here. It's not necessary, but in order to do that you've got to have a good compost mix. You can't drop in compost from a bag of multi-purpose and expect that to feed your peppers and chilies through the entire season. I mean, these plants, when they're away, they'll be up here. What I tend to do is that side is lower, so I put the taller ones on that side, but they'll be up here, and that's a lot of growth, and you're not going to get, I don't think, sufficient nutrition from a bag of off-the-shelf multi-purpose compost. So I will be making up my own blend as usual. I'll also be reusing some old compost and some sandy loam that we've sieved out of the garden. Actually, we're in a very stony area here, so sometimes when we remove stones from a patch, we'll then clean them off a bit. I'm not polishing them, just scrub them off a bit, and the sandy soil that we get from that's quite a useful ingredient in potting mixes. Gives a bit of structure to it. So we'll use a bit of that and some other ingredients, make up a really nice mixture that are going to keep these plants happy and healthy for the entire season, hopefully with no liquid feed needed. Right, better get on with the compost. So what I've got here is some old potting soil, and you can see that actually this still looks really nice, and I wouldn't mind betting that there's at least as much, if not more, goodness left in this old potting soil than you get out of a bag of multi-purpose now. So this is still nice stuff, and I'm always happy to reuse it. It's no problem with that, as long as the plants that you've had in it haven't got any signs of soil-borne diseases, stuff that's going to linger in the soil and cause problems when you reuse it, or then if you go to a different plant family when you're reusing it, then you should get away with that. So long as there are no obvious problems, perfectly fine to reuse that soil. I mean, after all, we do that in our gardens all the time. The only thing is, I don't like to just throw some fertilizer at it. I know that's common practice because I've seen many videos where gardeners are just taking their old potting soil, very often it's for potatoes, that's very common, chucking in some potato fertilizer and then reusing it, but the soil itself becomes a pretty lifeless substance. I don't think it's great to do that. I want to add back more organic matter, try and keep this potting mix in really good condition. So what am I doing? Well, I've got that potting soil, then I've got some homemade compost, and you can see this has still got little bits. I mean, most of this is almost broken down, but it's little stems, little woody bits. None of that matters. It's all fine in this sort of mixture. In fact, probably quite good, but there's lots of this. This is homemade compost, so green waste from the kitchen garden here. It's probably a bit seedy, I'm afraid, because our compost heap is not a particularly hot heap, so weed seeds will probably survive in that. I'm going to add to that some of this sandy loam, and this has been in the dark, so you can see these little straggly white bits. I don't know if they'll show up on the camera, but these are weed seeds that have germinated, and nothing's come of them, of course, because it's been in the dark. You can see the little bits of grit in it. I'm not going to worry too much about the weed seeds. It'll add a little bit of bulk to this job, and then the lovely ingredient, horse compost, and a fair old bit of it. This is good stuff, and that's going to keep this potting mix in great condition, not just for this potting up these peppers, but also for the next time I need to reuse this. I'm going to be quite generous with this. The peppers love it. It's going to keep them happy all season. I'm certainly not going to need to give them lots of extra feed along the way. Right, that's probably enough of that. I am going to add a bit of fish blood and bone. I don't know if that's even necessary, but I do use fish blood and bone a fair bit in the garden because it's a slow release organic fertilizer. It's not too harsh. It's not going to cause any problems. So I will I'll get a little bit of that in there. And then give this a good mix up. Well, bags of multi-purpose compost. Years ago, I used to be able to find some pretty nice stuff for not too much money, and that's a lot more difficult now. A lot of the stuff is really a bit rubbish, but I find myself nowadays, I think almost every time I will be mixing up my own blend from whatever I've got lying around. Old potting soil, sieved soil from the garden, whatever I've got that I think will make a nice textured mixture. So you're looking for two things with your potting mix. One is providing the nutrition that the plants need, Well, I think I've got that covered here. And the other is providing a nice texture to the soil, because you want it to hold the right sort of amount of moisture. You don't want it to be soggy. You don't want it to be one of those soils which caps over and becomes very dry. On the other hand, you want it to drain nicely. Getting that balance of properties, I find, is a lot easier when I'm just here mixing stuff up. You can have a feel of it, see whether it's clumping together or how it looks, and I think you get a better final result, because you can adjust that. If I think this is a bit heavy and claggy, I'll put a bit more of the sandy loam in. If I look at it and I think there's not enough organic matter, I'll put another shovel of the horse compost in, or some more homemade compost. So I like to do it that way, but there's all sorts of ways of preparing your potting mix. The one thing I don't do is just reuse the old potting soil without adding back some organic matter. So I don't just add feed to it, because I don't think that's the best thing to do for the soil. And I want the plants to be happy this season, but I want this soil to be in a good state to reuse next season as well. And I think that should do very nicely. So this is a pretty easy job. I'm going to start loading this up with compost, and I'm not going to plant this any deeper. These stems already at this stage are quite woody down here, and unlike the tomatoes where you sink them deeper, they will produce new roots from the stems. Now, pepper plants can do that, but only when they're very young. At this stage, the stems start to turn woody, and then it's not going to happen. So I don't want to plant these any deeper. I've just pulled the seed leaves off there because I don't need them. They're not doing anything useful. So just top this up until I've got the right sort of height for it. A little bit more. That will do nicely. And we've got a really nice root system here. I'm pleased to see that it's not pot bound. There's plenty of root, but certainly not too much. Also, I've got some that are in round pots, but most of them, thankfully, are in square pots, and they produce much nicer root systems, because the roots don't spiral round when they hit the corners. They tend to start growing down, and you get a lot of root growth in the right sort of direction. In a round pot, they'll whirl around, and then they never establish quite as well as those from a square pot. If I had my way, nobody would ever manufacture a round pot again, because they're not as good for the plants. I don't have enough square pots for everything, of course, so I've got to use some round ones, but most of these are in square pots, and the roots you get from those are really nice. Yeah, all the way around, lovely root system. So in it goes, and I will just fill around. Now, as you can see, I'm going to have to mix up a lot of this compost, because this is a big old pot. Now I don't want to firm this in too hard. It will slump a little bit when I water, but I'm not going to firm it in too much. And that is enough compost. Leave plenty of space on the top for watering, and that's that. One down, 35 to go. So I have these saucers here that I can put these on, because otherwise these mixtures always drain fairly well, so the water will run out, and I like to catch a little bit of that, and it can take the time to absorb it. But there's too much space in here. Maybe if I'd got a smaller one of these, but this I think was the closest size for this pot, so there's too much volume here for water. So if this happened to be full, because I've overwatered it, and it's possible because it's on an automatic system here. I can only time it to the nearest minute, so it is possible that this gets filled with water. That is too much water for this pot to sit in. So what I do now is fill around the outside with some stones. This is just a small section of those that I've sieved out of the garden beds. One of the few benefits of being in a area where they've been extracting gravel. It'll tell you how much stone there is in our garden. But that's nice. Just fill those up with stones. They'll take up some of the volume, and in any event, that makes a nice environment for the little pepper plant there. Well, this job is finally done, and it doesn't matter how many times I do this, I always underestimate just how long it's going to take, just how much effort it is. So, I mean, I suppose they're fairly big pots, so there's 360 litres of compost stuff to mix up, and my wife's been helping me with that, thank goodness, or I would never have got this done. And you know, it's a lot to move around and pot up and so on. But now that it's done, and with this sort of compost blend, I've got the micro irrigation here for watering, so this is really a low maintenance area. I should not need to feed these for the entire season, so there's really nothing much to do here except come in and harvest them. I will be checking the plants from time to time just to make sure there are no aphids around. Very often we get none. Last year there were some, and it was a little bit unusual. There was a lot of aphid activity last year, but we've got a really healthy population of ladybirds, so hopefully they will take care of them, or at least their larvae will be on that case pretty soon. I will need to give these a little bit of support. A few of these are quite tall, and I don't pinch my peppers out, not usually. These I allow to grow more or less naturally. There's just, and on occasion I will pinch out one of the really tall ones, but generally I don't. But these are going to need some support. They'll be better when the stems thicken up. Now they're not packed together in the propagators. They've got more space, they've got better light, and everything should be better for them now. So these stems will, I think, quite quickly thicken up. But even so, when they're carrying the crop, there's a heck of a weight, and I've got bars here I can tie strings to and so on. But I think I will put in some kind of support for these peppers, run some canes along that I can tie the stems to, and just make sure they don't flop over. Doesn't need a huge amount. The stems are pretty substantial and woody when they're growing well, so it just needs something to stop them from falling over. But apart from that, this job is done, and this is my favorite area of the garden in the summer because it's low maintenance but immensely productive, and I love the peppers and chilies we get out of here. But anyway, that is all for this video, so thank you ever so much for watching, and bye for now.